Hey everyone, welcome to the third installment of Know Your History, and today I'm going to be talking about the English Civil War. Similar to the Civil War in the United States, the English Civil War was one of the most defining moments in Britain's history and politics, but for very different reasons. While the American Civil War was centered primarily around states' rights and slavery, the English Civil War broke out as a direct challenge to the monarchy's power over the British people. The events that unfolded in England between August of 1642 and September of 1651 sent shockwaves throughout all of Europe, in particular the royal class, who watched in horror as the first trial and execution of a king by his own people occurred for the first time in history. The English Civil War is also considered to be a catalytic precursor to the European Enlightenment, as British philosophers such as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes had their ideas become heavily influenced by its events and outcome. The English Civil War is an extremely complex topic, so it's important to lay some contextual groundwork regarding everyone who was involved. Perhaps the most important figure in the war was King Charles I, who was the second son of King James IV of Scotland. He moved to England at the age of 3 when his father inherited the English throne and remained there for most of his life. After his older brother, Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales, died in 1612, Charles became heir apparent to the English, Irish, and Scottish thrones at the age of 12. A deeply religious man, King Charles I believed in the concept of absolute monarchy. He held the conviction that God appointed those of royal lineage to govern according to their own conscience through the divine right of destiny. For this reason and numerous others, Charles I frequently clashed with the English Parliament, who were constantly seeking to curb his power. King Charles I imprisoned and executed political dissidents without trial, levied harsh taxes on both the poor and the rich, and was overall such a terrible leader that he inspired the English to never trust in the system of monarchy again. Another important aspect of the English Civil War was the emphasis on religion. In the years that led up to the fighting, Catholicism and Protestantism, as well as some other more obscure sects of Christianity, battled relentlessly for supremacy in nations all across Europe. This played a crucial role in sparking the English Civil War, as the marriage between Charles I and the Catholic Princess Henrietta Maria of France enraged many English Protestants who did not want a Catholic queen. They would accuse Charles of abusing his power and eventually made him the first king in history to be tried in a court of law and executed by beheading. When the war officially started, the two opposing sides comprised primarily of two parties, the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. The Parliamentarians were made up of mostly Protestants who felt disenfranchised by Charles I's reign, especially Puritans, many of whom had been forced to flee to North America in order to avoid persecution. Along with being mostly Protestant, the majority of them were also working-class people who were angry about Charles I's high taxes and strict rules on religious and other personal freedoms. The derogatory nickname given to them was the Roundheads, a reference to the way many of them wore their hair flat or closely cropped around the head, in contrast to wealthier Englishmen who wore their hair in ringlets. The ultimate goal of the Parliamentarians was to relinquish all executive power to Parliament. The Royalists, on the other hand, sided with King Charles I and his son Charles II. Like Charles I, they believed in the divine right of kings. They were nicknamed the Cavaliers by their political opponents due to the fact that they often fought on cavalry, and the word has the same Latin root as the French chevalier, which translates to horseman. Owning a horse in this time period was very expensive, and such horses were seen as a symbol of wealth and prestige. Therefore, this nickname was derogatory because it mocked the snobbery and prejudiced attitudes of the Royalists. Although the Royalists were not exclusively Catholic or Protestant, much like Charles I himself, who seemed to enjoy varying facets of both sects, they still believed in the monarch's divine power to control the church. One of the most central historical figures in the English Civil Wars is Oliver Cromwell, famous for being a highly skilled military strategist and political leader. Cromwell spearheaded the rebellion against the Royalists and was celebrated by his followers for his performance in the Battle of Marston Moor and the Battle of Naseby during the First English Civil War. During the Second English Civil War, Cromwell again displayed highly expert competency when he led a siege against the powerful castle of Pembroke that succeeded in just 8 weeks. He then marched his army to confront the pro-royalist Scottish army known as the Engagers and secured a critical victory despite being outnumbered 2-1. Although little is known about the first 40 years of his life, the historical record shows Cromwell was an intensely religious Puritan Protestant and that he experienced his religious conversion sometime during the 1630s. To make things somewhat easier to digest, the English Civil War can be divided into three major civil wars. The beginning of the First English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1646, broke out at the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, when it had become increasingly clear to both sides that there would be no compromise between the king and Parliament. The next important battle was the Battle of Marston Moor in June of 1644. It was the largest battle in the entirety of the English Civil Wars, and it involved more than 45,000 men. A year later, the Battle of Naseby erupted in June of 1645. Lasting about only 3 hours, it proved to be a humiliating defeat for the Royalists. King Charles I suffered heavy losses, from veteran infantrymen to all of his artillery and stores. In May of 1646, he surrendered to the Scots, and then 1 month later, his capital, Oxford, would surrender to Parliament. After the First Civil War ended, it left behind a power vacuum which would make way for the beginning of the Second Civil War to begin, which lasted from 1648 to 1649. Charles I had surrendered and Parliament had assumed power, but they, like Charles, were met with numerous revolts in places such as Essex, Kent, North Wales, and South Wales. In June of 1647, almost a year after Charles I had surrendered to the Scots, Oliver Cromwell and his men drew up a list of proposals for the king to agree to. Unfortunately, they could not reach a mutual agreement, and Charles I escaped captivity. After Oliver Cromwell's crushing victories mentioned earlier, as well as his victory in the Battle of Preston, Charles I was recaptured, convicted of treason, and sentenced to death. After Charles I surrendered, the Scots handed him over to Parliament, who decided to imprison him and put him on trial. He managed to escape in November of 1647, but was recaptured in December of 1648 and sent to the now famous Windsor Castle, which still stands in London today. This right here is Holdenby House, where Charles was initially kept prisoner and escaped from. It is now a popular wedding venue in Northamptonshire, UK. Following the trial and execution of the king after the Second Civil War, England was officially declared a republic. It was dubbed the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Oliver Cromwell was given the title of Lord Protector. Under the Commonwealth governance, the majority of political power resided with the Parliament and the English Council of State. After leading several successful campaigns throughout the British Isles, in particular an extremely bloody one in Ireland that resulted in famine, massive population reduction, indentured servitude, and an outbreak of the bubonic plague, Oliver Cromwell died from natural causes in 1658. It should be safe to assume there probably weren't any Irish people crying at his funeral. Cromwell's son, Richard Cromwell, briefly took over, but was not able to continue it for more than a year. Despite his father's promises of a republic, Cromwell's radical Puritanism had led him to act in ways similar to King Charles I, and the English Parliament and public as a whole eventually agreed on a constitutional monarchy rather than a republic, thus forever changing the course of British politics. This right here is the Commonwealth flag, which was flown from 1649 to 1658. The combination of the Red Cross of England and the Harp of Ireland symbolized the newfound, and soon-to-be short-lived, Republic of England. It was the replacement of the British Union flag during the Interregnum, which was the period between King Charles I's death and King Charles II's return to power. By the time the Third Civil War began in 1649, Ireland had already been at war for more than 8 years, rebelling against English rule since 1641. Oliver Cromwell both successfully and brutally crushed the rebellion by 1650, but the last Confederate Catholic troops didn't fully surrender until 1653. After working closely with Presbyterian and Catholic Scots who were still bitter about the Commonwealth's Puritan rule, King Charles II negotiated with a prominent Scottish Presbyterian movement called the Covenanters to crown him as the King of Scotland, which would mean he was also, by extension, the King of Ireland and England. The English responded to this by invading Scotland, with Oliver Cromwell at the helm of the attack, resulting in several more battles, most notably in Edinburgh, Dunbar, and Worcester. Known for being the final and most important battle to mark the end of the long English Civil Wars, the Battle of Worcester was fought on September 3, 1651. Oliver Cromwell would die on the same day in 1658. The battle began when Charles II and his Scottish supporters invaded England with the intention of seizing the throne. Unfortunately, the Royalists were vastly outnumbered by Cromwell's troops, and Charles II had made several strategic mistakes. First, assuming the English wouldn't be prepared for invasion, and secondly, placing too much hope in the English religious minorities he thought would rally to his support, when instead they united against the Scots with the rest of the English citizenry. An estimated 3,000 men were killed and more than 10,000 were taken prisoner. Charles II was forced to flee, and he wouldn't be able to come back to England and rule until 1660. King Charles II was the second son of Charles I and his wife Henrietta. He spent most of his youth fighting Roundheads on behalf of his father before fleeing to France after his execution in 1649. After a brief stint in Holland, Charles II traveled to Scotland, where he was crowned king in 1650 due to previous negotiations his father had made with Scottish Catholics, as well as some of his own negotiating. After Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth had essentially crashed and burned, Charles II returned to England in 1660 to fill the vacant throne. He was remarkably tolerant of those who had condemned his father to death, executing only 9 of the conspirators. He did not object to Parliament's limiting of his power, promoted religious tolerance, and overall seemed to learn from his father's mistakes. Despite his reign facing some major setbacks, such as being defeated by the Dutch in a poorly managed war, the Great Fire of London that destroyed much of the city, and the Great Plague of 1665, the era of King Charles II's rule is known as the time of Merry Old England. The English public was happy to have their throne restored, particularly by a monarch who knew the only way his reign would be successful would be by his acknowledgement of the will of his people, and more importantly, the will of Parliament. That's everything for today. Thanks so much for watching. As I'm sure you could tell, the English Civil War is an incredibly complex topic, so if there's anyone who wants me to go into more details regarding any of the people or events that were discussed today, let me know below in the comments. Until then, I'll see you next time. Bye!